Hi, I'm Marjorie. My son said the painting above my fireplace was worthless, sold it without asking, just to decorate his wife's new spa. But it wasn't just a painting. It was the last thing my husband ever gave me. And inside it, he left something only I was meant to find. They thought they erased me, erased my name, my past, my role in their lives. But what happens when the woman they tried to silence holds the code to everything they built? Would you keep quiet, or speak loud enough for the world to hear? The sun had just begun to dip behind the tree line, casting a soft gold hue across the backyard. The garden was dressed up like a magazine spread. White linen tablecloths, glass pitchers of lemonade, pastel balloons tied to each chair. It was Rowan's 9th birthday, and Valora had gone all out. From the smile plastered on her face to the catered food stations, you'd think it was a local fundraiser, not a child's birthday. I stood off to the side with a plate I wasn't hungry for, watching Joran charm his way from group to group. He was always good at that. He had his father's voice and his own brand of smugness. Valora laughed too loudly as she recounted how, "We've built this little empire from nothing." She didn't mention the help I'd quietly offered in the beginning, watching Rowan, cooking when they were overloaded, handing them a check when the first business loan didn't go through. That part didn't fit the narrative. "Hey, Mom," Joran called across the yard, gesturing to the painting propped near the drink table. "Remember this?" He tilted his head to Valora. "It's that forest thing she kept over her fireplace for decades. Found it while cleaning out the guest room. Thought it might add a vintage vibe to the party." I took a step forward, my stomach tightening. The painting, Autumn Evening, was a simple scene of pine trees under a burnt orange sky. It wasn't valuable to anyone but me. My late husband had bought it from a street artist the year Rowan was born. It had hung over our fireplace ever since. I didn't even realize they'd taken it down. Valora chuckled, sipping her mimosa. I told him it was probably worth less than the catering. A few guests laughed. Not cruelly. Just like it was harmless. A joke. I tried to force a smile, but something inside me shifted. My fingers clenched the paper plate. I excused myself to the bathroom, though I didn't need to go. I just needed air. Later that evening, after most guests had trickled out, and the yard looked less like a party and more like an empty showroom, I returned to my small bungalow in Asheville. The familiar creak of the front door greeted me, and I slipped off my shoes with practiced ease. The house smelled like lavender and old paper, comforting. Still, I went straight to the living room. The spot above the fireplace was bare. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd moved the painting during my last spring cleaning. Maybe it was in the closet, in the attic. But as I turned in a slow circle, a cold weight settled in my chest. I picked up my phone and called Joran. He answered with his usual detached tone. "Hey, Mom, what's up? Where's the painting?" There was a pause. "What painting?" "Autumn Evening. It was hanging in my living room." "Oh, that." "Yeah, I sold it. Valora needed some art pieces for the spa launch, and honestly, it looked kind of dated. We didn't think you'd mind. You've got, what, 1,000,000 old things around?" I didn't respond. He kept talking, filling the silence like he always did. Besides, it was just gathering dust. Better it serves a purpose, right? I ended the call without saying goodbye. My hand trembled, not from anger, but from something deeper. A hollowness I couldn't quite name. A few days passed. I kept to myself. I read, I watered the garden, I made tea. And then, while chatting with my neighbor, Ellen, about her daughter's new job, she offhandedly said, "Have you seen Valora's new spa downtown? Gorgeous space. She mentioned selling some old art to fund the interior. Something from your collection, maybe?" That word, collection, scraped at me. I didn't have a collection. I had memories. Moments captured in canvas and frame. And she'd turned one into decor. I stood there on the porch nodding, but inside, something was rearranging. Back home, I poured myself a glass of wine I didn't really want and sat in front of the empty fireplace. It stared back at me, bare and echoing. I closed my eyes and let myself remember. Virgil had given me that painting on our anniversary. You said you liked it. He'd shrugged awkwardly. It's not fancy, but it made me think of you. Quiet, but not simple. I'd loved him for that. And now, our son, my son, had reduced it to nothing more than wall filler. A prop. Something to match a color scheme. I walked to the old photo albums tucked under the bookshelf, found one from the year Rowan was born. There it was, our mantle, the painting hanging proudly, slightly crooked as it always had been. I stared at the photograph, at the painting. My eyes narrowed. There, near the bottom corner, just barely visible, was something I'd never noticed before. A shape, a line, a sequence, something hidden, something he didn't know was there. A week had passed since Rowan's birthday party, but the sting still lived under my skin like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. I'd managed to keep busy, tidying drawers that didn't need it, refolding the same blankets, organizing my tea tins by flavor, and then alphabetically. But that afternoon, something broke the haze. I ran into Cheryl, an old colleague from the school district, in the produce aisle at Harris Teeter. We exchanged pleasantries. Weather, grandkids, the usual. And just as I was about to reach for a bunch of kale, she leaned in with a conspiratorial smile. I saw Valora's new spa downtown, she said. Absolutely gorgeous. She told the whole story, how they bootstrapped it themselves from the ground up. Isn't that something? My grip on the shopping cart tightened. I forced a smile, nodding. That is something. I barely remember what I bought after that. I walked through the aisles in a daze, dropped a few things into the basket. Yogurt, a box of crackers, some chamomile tea, and left without picking up the kale. The drive home blurred into a string of taillights and commercials on the radio. I didn't want to believe what I already knew, but I needed to see it with my own eyes. 2 days later, I took the bus to Charlotte. I didn't call ahead. I didn't tell Joran. I just slipped into the city like a ghost, clutching a tote bag and wearing a plain beige coat I hadn't touched in years. I told the front desk girl I was considering booking a massage for a friend. She didn't recognize me. Why would she? The spa was sleek, minimalistic. White oak floors, pale green walls, soft lighting that made everything feel both intimate and expensive. I drifted from room to room, pretending to admire the design. Then I saw it. On a feature wall in the lounge, framed by soft uplighting, was a canvas, almost identical to the one Joran had taken. The tones were slightly more muted, the lines digitally softened, but I knew every brushstroke. It wasn't a copy. It was a replication, down to the overlapping trees in the lower right corner. My husband's initials, once tucked beneath the frame, had been erased. Above it was a plaque, built on love, effort, and vision. No mention of me, no trace. I left without saying a word. The next morning, Joreen and Valora showed up unannounced with a box of pastries and two too-bright smiles. Valora kissed me on the cheek as if nothing had happened and made herself right at home in my kitchen. I set the kettle on the stove, every movement deliberate. Halfway through her second bite of almond croissant, Valora leaned forward. So, I've been thinking, we'd love to name the spa after you, I blinked. Excuse me? She giggled. Just the name. Marjorie Wellness Studio. Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? You have such a graceful presence. It gives the place legacy. Legacy? I looked at Jorn, who shrugged like this was no big deal. It'd be honorary, he added. No financial ties, just branding. I set my tea down. No? Valora blinked. Oh, I just thought... No, I said again. You took something that meant the world to me, sold it without asking, and now you want to put my name on the building you used it to help fund. That's not legacy. That's theft dressed up as sentiment. The silence hung in the air like wet laundry. Joran opened his mouth, closed it, then finally muttered, It's not a big deal, Mom. I smiled, tight, rehearsed. Of course not. Not to you. I walked them to the door, hugged Rowan, thanked them for the visit. All the while, my heart was pounding like fists against glass. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my husband's old reading chair, wrapped in a shawl, leafing through his journals. He'd always been meticulous, his sketches filled with tiny notes, observations, layers of thoughts only he understood. On one of the last pages, in his handwriting, I read, "Value is rarely in what's visible. Hide it where they'll never look." I closed the book slowly, fingers trembling. It wasn't just a painting, it never was. I pulled the old storage box from the hallway closet, the one we never labeled because Virgil said, "If you write important, someone's bound to open it." Inside was a folder, worn, thick, and sealed with a strip of masking tape. The label read, "Virgil, Confidential." The house had gone quiet again, just like it always did after they left. I sat alone at the kitchen table, my fingers tracing circles around a chipped spot on my coffee mug. The pastries they brought remained untouched, still in their pink box on the counter. Valora had chosen almond again, as if that erased the offense of the week before. It was nearing midnight, but sleep felt like a stranger I hadn't seen in years. I shuffled into the living room, the old floorboards groaning beneath me, and settled into Virgil's armchair, the one he always said was too ugly to replace. I let my eyes drift across the mantel, now empty, hollow like a socket missing its eye. Then, without warning, I felt it again. That pull. I reached for the photo I'd found days ago, the one of the painting still hanging, just a year after Rowan was born. The way the late afternoon sun had caught the edge of the frame, it had highlighted something I'd never seen before. At the time, I thought it was a trick of the light, but now, staring at it again under the yellow glow of the floor lamp, I saw it clearly. A faint line. A shape. No. Shapes. Symmetrical. Deliberate. I got up, walked to the hall closet, and pulled out the storage box. The one Virgil had marked winter sweaters in his messy handwriting, even though it never once held a single scarf. I carried it back to the table and began digging through it like a woman possessed. Beneath the layers of old paperwork and military pension files, I found the envelope I'd left untouched for years. Virgil, Confidential. My fingers trembled, but not from fear. I peeled back the seal. Inside, I found a folded sketch, the kind he used to doodle on napkins during road trips. But this wasn't casual. It was a full rendering. Trees, sky, the same fading light. But where the original painting showed smooth brushwork, this version had markings, numbers, letters, tiny triangles aligned between branches like constellations. I spread the sketch across the dining table, beside the photo of the painting. I could almost hear his voice in the silence. "Look closer, Marjorie." So I did. Shape by shape, my eyes mapped the overlaps. The bottom left corner held a cluster that mirrored the initials VJM, our initials. But next to them were 4 digits, 1993. The year Rowan was born, the year he gave me that painting. In the top right, faint but clear, coordinates. I knew them instantly. Virgil had taken me there once, back when Rowan was still in diapers. "A weekend retreat," he'd said. "Just us and the trees." I hadn't thought about that cabin in over a decade. I opened his journal, flipping through pages until I found one titled Legacy, rewritten. Underneath it, "Real value is rarely obvious. Hide it where they'd never dare to search." I sat back, stunned. Not because I'd found clues, but because I hadn't seen them all along. Virgil hadn't been sentimental. He was careful, strategic. He'd hidden something, and now it was mine to find. I opened my laptop and typed the coordinates into a mapping site. It brought up a property in western North Carolina, still listed under a trust. Not his name, not mine either. But I recognized the name embedded in the trust, an acronym we'd once joked about, Vera Holdings, after Valora and Rowan. He'd used their names, but not for them. My breath slowed. This wasn't about a painting anymore. It wasn't even about being overlooked or insulted. This was bigger. I stood and reached for my coat. But before I could take another step, my phone lit up on the table. Joran, calling at midnight. The phone rang again before I had the chance to let his name fade from the screen. Joran. Midnight. I didn't want to pick up, but I did. Maybe some foolish part of me still believed he was calling to say sorry. Or maybe I just wanted to hear his voice and measure what he'd become. "Hey, Mom," he said. His voice was low, softened like a warm cloth over a sharp blade. "I've been thinking. Are you sure you're not misremembering things? Dad had a lot of old sketches. I mean, it's been decades, right?" I didn't answer. Memory's tricky, especially now. There it was, slipped in gently. I was too old to be trusted, too fragile to know what I saw. I hung up. No goodbye, no explanation, just ended the call. He didn't call back. By morning, I was in Charlotte again. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I took the early bus. Same coat, same tote, same empty space in my chest. I didn't need to pretend to be a customer this time. I just walked in like I belonged there. Because in a way, I did. The lobby was quiet. Candles flickering against glass. Light music playing the kind of melodies that try too hard to be calming. I wandered past the reception desk. The young woman behind the counter smiled at me, offered tea, and told me to let her know if I had any questions. I nodded, keeping my hands in my pockets. It was hanging in the same spot. That damned replica, framed perfectly, lit just right. Inspired Original by Valora Bennett, printed on a small brass plate beneath it. The trees were still mine. The shadows still moved the same way. They just softened the edges, muted the gold in the sky, watered it down like they'd done to everything I was. A woman beside me glanced over. "Isn't it stunning? You can tell the artist really understands stillness." Stillness. I walked deeper into the spa, past rooms named Serenity, Elevation, Balance. Each one was dressed in shades I'd once painted my guest bedroom. In the treatment room, a diffuser puffed out lavender, the same oil I'd kept in our linen closet for years. Even the throw pillows in the waiting nook looked like ones from my couch, down to the embroidered vines on the trim. I didn't make a scene. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. But I saw everything. I walked out without being noticed, which I suppose had become the theme of this season of my life. The drive back to Asheville was long and silent. The highway blurred past the window. I didn't bother with the radio. Instead, I replayed everything in my head. His words, her plaque, my erased initials. They hadn't just taken the painting. They'd taken the origin story and handed it to themselves like a prize. Back home, I set my keys on the hook and walked straight to the attic stairs. I hadn't been up there in months, maybe years. I pulled down the ladder, one creak at a time, and climbed up into the dust. Virgil's military box sat in the corner, half covered by an old wool blanket. It was heavier than I remembered. I dragged it downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. The key was still taped to the underside. He never trusted combination locks. Inside were fragments of his life I'd forgotten. Discharge papers, a Polaroid of us at Coney Island, a gold button from his old jacket, a deed, and beneath that, a torn page that looked like it had been folded too many times, coordinates, and a phrase written in pencil, "She'll know when it's time." I sat down slowly. I did know. This wasn't about family anymore. It wasn't about being respected, or heard, or loved. Those ships had sailed. This was about truth. If they wouldn't hear me, then I'd speak to someone who could make them listen. That evening, I opened my laptop and searched the number Virgil had scribbled in the corner of the paper. Colson Daniels, former JAG attorney, now listed as a private legal consultant in Raleigh. I dialed the number. A woman answered, "Daniels and Associates." I took a breath. "This is Marjorie Bennett. I believe Mr. Daniels used to serve with my husband." "Yes, ma'am. He remembers Captain Bennett fondly. How can we help you?" I looked at the painting's photo on my screen. At the code. "I think it's time we talked about what Virgil left me." 3 days after that phone call with Coulson, I returned to the spa, not as a customer, not as a bystander, but as someone with a purpose. I had made an appointment with neither the front desk nor my son. I didn't need permission to walk into a place funded, in part, by what they stole from me. The receptionist, a young woman with impeccable lashes and nails painted the color of rosewater, looked up at me blankly when I stepped inside. "Delivery goes around the side entrance, ma'am." I blinked. "Excuse me?" She tilted her head. "You're not here with one of the vendors?" "No," I said evenly. "I'm here to speak with Jorn Bennett." Her brows raised. "Do you have an appointment?" I didn't answer. I turned, walked past her toward the hallway. She didn't stop me. She didn't know who I was. My face wasn't on the wall, my name wasn't on the plaque, and my story had been scrubbed out of this space like a smudge on a mirror. I found Jorn standing near a consultation room, talking to a woman in a powder blue blazer. He noticed me, excused himself, and met me halfway with a tight smile. "Mom, this isn't really a good time." I wasn't asking if it was. He looked over his shoulder, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, I don't know what this is about, but you can't just show up here like this. It's disruptive." "Disruptive," I repeated. "That's what I am to you now?" He lowered his voice. "You've already caused enough waves, okay? Between the questions from Coulson's office and your little visit last week, people are starting to ask things. We're trying to build something here. Something clean. Something professional. And I'm the stain? You don't get it. You have nothing they want, Mom. You're not part of this world." That last line hit harder than I expected, even though I should have seen it coming. It wasn't just what he said. It was how easily it slipped out, like he'd rehearsed it, like it had lived in his throat for years, waiting for the right moment to be said out loud. I didn't respond. I just nodded and turned around. I walked out of that spa without another word, without a backward glance. But something had changed inside me. The silence that once weighed on me had turned into steel. I was done waiting for respect, done hoping for acknowledgement. I didn't need their validation. What I had was truth, and now the tools to use it. That night, back in Asheville, I spread Virgil's papers across the dining table. One document caught my eye. I hadn't noticed it before, a folded page tucked between sketches. It was a more complex diagram than the one I'd studied earlier. More shapes, more symbols, a layering of codes. And at the bottom, a note in Virgil's handwriting. "If they don't listen to you, they will hear this." I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote a letter. Short, direct. No venom, just facts. "To Joren and Valora," I wrote, "if either of you continues to profit from what does not belong to you, I will respond. Not with emotion, not with words, with proof. Publicly, legally, and entirely. Marjorie." I mailed it the next morning, certified, with tracking, no return address. By late afternoon, I was back in the garden, pruning the hydrangeas, when my phone buzzed from the windowsill. I dried my hands and picked it up. New email. Subject, Legacy, Urgent Review. Completed it was from Coulson. I opened it and read the first line. "I've reviewed everything. You were right, and you have more than you think." The morning sun hadn't yet broken over the hills when I stepped into Coulson's office. The building sat tucked between a bank and an insurance firm, unassuming, exactly the kind of place where powerful things happened quietly. He greeted me with a nod, not the kind meant to impress, but one that said, "I've seen worse, and I know when something's real." He handed me a folder thick with copies, legal seals, and highlighted lines. "Your husband was methodical," he said. "Every asset moved through a shell trust locked under a contingency clause. That clause only activates in the event of proven betrayal by direct descendants." I blinked. "And what exactly qualifies as betrayal?" "Selling off inherited items without consent, erasing your name from contributions, misusing intellectual property. It's all listed." I sat down across from him, the weight of it sinking in. Not just the documents, but the fact that Virgil had seen this coming long before I ever did. He hadn't just left a message in a painting. He'd left an escape plan. Back in Asheville, I barely made it through the front door before my phone buzzed. A notification lit up the screen. Valora Bennett is live. I tapped in. She stood in front of a curated spa wall, soft earth tones, dried eucalyptus, and a blown-up canvas that mimicked mine down to the trees on the left side. Her hair was styled into gentle waves, her makeup natural but calculated. "We're so excited to launch this new chapter," she beamed into the camera. "When Jorn and I first started dreaming about this space, we had nothing but grit and heart. No mention of me, no trace of what they used to get here." As the camera panned across the room, I saw pieces of my past scattered like souvenirs. My living room palette, the antique side table from my hallway, a mirror I hadn't realized was missing. She continued, "Every detail here was curated from our vision of wellness, one born from our love for this community." It wasn't anger I felt watching her speak, it was focus. That same quiet clarity I used to feel before starting a new quilt, measuring twice, cutting once. I clicked out of the stream. Then I called Coulson. By the end of that day, he'd drafted the injunction. I printed it, folded it, and drove the 2 hours back to Charlotte. This time, I didn't wait for a receptionist to acknowledge me. I walked through the front doors, handed the envelope to the woman behind the desk, and said, "Please make sure Valora gets this." She glanced down. "What is it?" I smiled, just barely. "Tell her it's not branding, it's theft." The ride home was silent. My thoughts uninterrupted, except for the hum of tires on asphalt. It was dark by the time I got back, but I didn't go to bed. Instead, I laid out the remaining sketches Virgil had left behind and opened the trust files again. I started aligning them, one page against another, symbols against dates, coordinates against numbers. The codes in the painting weren't just decorative. They were keys, legal documents hidden in art, cross-referenced through time. It wasn't just about the spa. This was about everything he'd ever built. That night, I ignored 2 calls from Joran. I didn't feel petty, I felt precise. Let them wonder why I was quiet. Let them learn what that quiet really meant. I kept working until my eyes blurred. Just as I was closing the laptop, another notification appeared. From the federal database. "Your copyright infringement case has been received and assigned to a federal review officer." 2 mornings after filing the copyright claim, I received a thick envelope stamped with a law firm's name I didn't recognize. I didn't open it right away. I made my coffee, fed the birds, and sat on the porch for 20 minutes, pretending my name wasn't typed in capital letters across the front. When I finally tore it open, the language inside was clinical, precise, and condescending. A cease and desist. Valora had formally accused me of harassment and defamation. Reckless behavior causing emotional disruption to clients and staff. That's how they framed it. Me, the woman whose memories they stole, now painted as the threat. I didn't call her, I didn't scream. I scanned every page and forwarded it all to Coulson with a single line. "Your move." Then I went about my day. I swept the kitchen, I sorted the laundry, I watered the rosemary. And in the afternoon, just as the guilt began creeping into my chest like a draft, a knock came at the door. Rowan. His backpack looked heavier than usual. Valora's SUV was still idling at the curb. "I'm here for the weekend," he said casually, already stepping inside. I called out a thank you, or maybe it was a warning, toward the car window. Valora didn't wave. We spent the rest of the day like we used to when he was smaller. I made grilled cheese, he read comics on the rug. That evening, while I brewed tea, he pulled out his sketch pad and began to draw. "It's the woods," he said without looking up. "The kind you always talk about. From that painting you lost." I turned, mug paused halfway to my lips. He had drawn a clump of trees, simple, rough, but tucked in the branches were faint symbols, little dots and triangles, ones I recognized. I sat beside him. "Rowan," I said gently, "where did you get that pattern?" He shrugged. I think I saw it in my dreams. I retrieved Virgil's original sketch from the drawer, laid it next to Rowan's. The lines lined up, not by accident, not imagination. The final code. I overlaid the notes, circled the final coordinates. The puzzle was complete. A property deed, a sequence, VJM 93, 122. Virgil had hidden the last piece in a language only a child might notice. Innocent eyes, unfiltered. My grandson had brought me closure I'd been chasing for months. Later that night, I tucked him into bed and walked out to the porch. I needed air. My phone buzzed. Valora had posted again, an Instagram story. Her face glowed in candlelight. "Some people don't know when to retire gracefully," she said, her voice dripping sugar. The camera panned over a wall of wellness heritage. Photos, quotes, even a wooden carving eerily similar to one from my hallway. Joran had liked the post. I turned off the screen. I didn't cry. That part of me had dried up weeks ago. Instead, I returned inside and sat by Rowan, now softly snoring. His sketchpad rested on the floor. I picked it up, turned the page. He'd drawn a door beneath the trees, marked with the symbol for entry. I leaned down, brushed his hair from his forehead, and whispered, "They've drawn their line. Now I'll draw mine." The next morning, as the sun warmed the sidewalk and the robins began their usual chorus, I packed a small bag, kissed Rowan on the forehead, and boarded the first bus headed west, toward the place Virgil had pointed me to all along. The road narrowed as the bus curved deeper into the hills, pine trees closing in on either side like curtains ready to reveal a stage. I hadn't been this far west in years, not since Virgil insisted we take that weekend trip, calling it a dry run for retirement. Back then, I'd thought it was about escaping noise. Now I realized he'd been planning something else entirely. The driver let me off near a rusted mailbox with no name, just numbers half-faded from sun and rain. I walked up the gravel path, overgrown but familiar. Even the bend in the fence line matched the sketch. The cabin itself looked abandoned, shutters half-hanging, porch sagging. But I knew it was the right place. I circled around back, where the painting had always guided me. The shapes, the trees, the crooked angles, they weren't just aesthetic. They were coordinates, visual instructions. I counted paces from the oak to the moss-covered rock, then knelt and pushed aside the brush. There it was, a storm cellar door, sunken and worn, its handles rusted but intact. I tugged hard. It groaned, then gave. Inside was cool and dry, a small bulb dangling from the ceiling, surprisingly still functional. I flipped the switch and descended. The air smelled of cedar and old paper. Stacked along the walls were file boxes, wooden crates, and one large safe in the corner. It wasn't locked, not in the way I expected. The door swung open to reveal a phrase carved into the inner metal lining, "Only she knows the order." I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just exhaled. Inside were records, financial, architectural, sketches, photos of early product prototypes, trust filings. Everything Valora and Joran thought they'd buried. Everything they didn't know existed. Virgil had kept it all, and he'd named me, explicitly, as the sole rightful heir. Tucked in a sealed envelope at the top was a letter, yellowed but carefully preserved. "Marjorie," it began in his familiar cursive, "if you're reading this, it means they tried to erase you, and I knew they would. You were never second to them. You were always the keeper." He detailed his growing unease in the years before his death, how he'd seen Joran's ambition turn sharp, how Valora's charm calcified into calculation. "I couldn't stop them, but I could leave you what they'd never expect. Power. Quiet, legal, unshakable." His words didn't sting. They clarified. It was never that he hadn't defended me. It was that he knew he wouldn't live long enough to fight the war himself. I packed what I could into my bag. Key files, the original copyright registry, the patent blueprints, and took photos of the rest. I uploaded everything to a shared drive Coulson had already set up, then sent him a short message. The vault was real. Files are live. Back at the cabin table, I laid out the painting. The original. Not the version they sold. Not the manipulated replica Valora now hung like a crown jewel. This was mine. And in the bottom right corner, half hidden in the carved wooden frame, were those words again. Only she knows the order. I did. That afternoon, I scanned the document trail and filed the official affidavit with the Federal Copyright Office, along with Virgil's trust records and proof of asset misappropriation. It wasn't loud. It wasn't messy. It was permanent. By the time I locked the cellar and pulled the doors shut behind me, the sun had started to dip. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. A news alert. Spa Empire faces lawsuit over hidden inheritance scheme. Assets frozen pending investigation. I stared at the screen for a long time, not with triumph, but with stillness, like the forest around me. 3 weeks had passed since the lawsuit hit the news cycle, but the echoes lingered like dust after a demolition. The spa's website redirected to a bland under-maintenance page. The building itself had been shuttered, the once carefully styled front windows now plastered with a notice. Pending legal resolution. No interviews, no statements. Valora vanished from every platform. Joren, silent. Not a single call, not even a text. I'd imagined once upon a time that an apology might come. That he'd show up on my porch with that same sheepish look he used to give when he broke a window as a kid. But apologies from people who rewrite history tend to arrive too late, if at all. And strangely, I didn't need it anymore. Instead, I wrote my own closure. I sat at the kitchen table, pulled out a sheet of stationery I hadn't used since Virgil's funeral, and began writing a letter I never intended to send. Dear Joren, I began, there were moments I believed you would grow into the man your father saw in you. I waited. I excused. I explained things away to myself. But betrayal isn't just one act. It's a pattern. You erased me not because you forgot me, but because I reminded you of something you didn't want to owe. I paused, staring out the window where the hydrangeas had begun to bloom again. I still remember the first time you handed me a crayon drawing and told me it was just for me. It hung on the fridge for years. You gave me something from your heart once, and I gave you everything. That's the part you forgot. I signed it, folded the paper, and tucked it in the back of Virgil's sketchbook. Let it rest with the other things that didn't need to be said out loud. That weekend, Rowan came to stay again. He'd grown quieter, not solemn, just more thoughtful, as if the world had started whispering to him in ways he wasn't sure how to process. We spent the afternoon in the yard, pulling weeds, talking about books, and sharing ice cream out of the same pint container like conspirators. At one point, as we sat beneath the oak tree, he looked up from his sketch pad and asked, "Are you mad at Dad?" I didn't rush the answer. "No," I said finally, "but I won't forget." He nodded, and that was enough. Then he handed me a new drawing. A cabin, surrounded by trees, sunlight filtering through the branches. It looked almost exactly like the hidden property, but this one had me standing in front of it, holding a book, not a painting. "I made this for you," he said, "because it's yours." I couldn't speak. I just wrapped my arms around him. Later that night, after he'd gone to bed, I walked into my study. I had rehung the original painting, not for what it meant legally, not for what it uncovered, but because it was mine. Because Virgil saw me when others didn't. Beneath the frame, I'd added a small brass plaque. It read, "Legacy is not what you leave in your will. It's what they can't take from you." As I stood there, I caught my reflection in the glass, wrinkles deeper than they used to be, eyes sharper but not unkind, a body that bore history, a face that had survived erasure. I didn't flinch from it. I touched the edge of the frame and whispered to myself, "I'm not just his mother, I'm my own story." And I was still writing it. In life, sometimes the deepest betrayal doesn't come from enemies. It comes from the people we raised, the ones we trusted to carry our legacy. I learned that silence isn't weakness, it's a decision. And when used with clarity and truth, it becomes the strongest voice in the room. You don't have to yell to reclaim what's yours. Sometimes you just need to know when to speak and who to speak to. So I ask you, have you ever felt erased by the very people you loved most? What did you do about it? Let me know in the comments. Type 1 if this story touched you, or tell me where you're watching from. And if it didn't land for you, tell me why. I'm listening. Maybe your story is next. If this video made you pause, reflect, or feel seen, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There's more truth to uncover, more stories to share. Let's keep growing together.